Hello and welcome to this video. A political science maxim states that a country's strategy is determined by its geographical location. If that's true, then for Japan, stretching for thousands of miles through the Pacific Ocean, the sea is where it stands. Japan's archipelagic nature and scarcity of natural resources have dictated its reliance on the seas as a food source, but most importantly, for transporting domestically produced goods like cars and machineries, and for importing overseas extracted energetic sources. Just to give an example, the land of the rising sun depends on seaborne transports for about 60% of its total food consumption, and for about 85% of its energetic sources. Specifically, there are two main sea lanes that spread out from Japan, connecting it with the rest of the world. The first heads towards the Indian Ocean, linking Japan's biggest industrial hubs with the Persian Gulf, where the majority of Japanese and Asian fossil fuels are produced. Ships following this route pass through some hot waters, namely the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea and the Malacca Strait, making these lanes potentially at risk of being blocked. The second route is the Pacific one, starting from Tokyo and the Kansai areas towards the US West Coast biggest industrial hubs. For Japan, the US represents the richest export destination for its industry, making it a vital economic artery for Tokyo. Indeed, the sea represents Japan's strongest asset and simultaneously its biggest vulnerability. However, in its long history, the country has always been able to swiftly shift its strategic stance, adapting to the international environment. From a historian perspective, Japanese strategy has always been affected by the oceans. Back in the 1600s, the country's military leadership, the shogunate, decided to isolate the country from the rest of the world, using the ocean as a barrier against any foreign invasion. During World War II, Japan's navy briefly ruled over the Pacific, contending its control with the US. Now Tokyo is more reliant than ever on seaborne cargo, transporting its cars and computers abroad while importing natural resources and food for its domestic consumption. Nevertheless, in recent years, the Ryukyu archipelago and the contested islets of Dokuro Takeshima and Diaoyu Senkaku have become hotspots, worsening the relations between Tokyo, South Korea, and China. The abundancy of fossil fuels and of fishing areas in the South and East China Seas have also kindled a fierce competition over the definition of exclusive economic zone boundaries around these features. This greatly influenced Japanese strategic posturing towards the maritime environment. First, it brought Tokyo's interest back to the East and South China Seas, particularly in establishing control over the contested areas. Second, it sparked the Japanese military buildup, especially in constructing solid amphibious warfare capabilities, and in creating an early warning and deterrence system on the Nansei Shoto Island chain. Particularly, the rise of China's naval prowess and its aim of expanding its control over the first island chain brought Japan to seek a more active role in the Pacific region. In a similar fashion to how it contained the Soviet Pacific Fleet in the Sea of Japan during the Cold War, now Japan is adopting a strategy based on limiting Chinese maritime expansion towards the Pacific. Back in the 70s, during the Cold War, the 7th Fleet Commander, Admiral Thomas Hayward, developed a strategy aimed at denying the Soviets any possibility of launching a full-scale attack against Western Europe by forcing Moscow to leave a part of their forces guarding Russia's Far East Siberian border. The plan essentially focused on affecting Moscow's forces management decision by amassing US and Japanese forces on northern Honshu and Hokkaido bases, close to the Soviet naval forces located on Siberia's eastern coast. This move had a twofold effect. First, it tied down a big chunk of Soviet forces on Russia's eastern front, instead of having them all banded up on the European theater at the border with Germany. And second, it pinned down Soviet Pacific Fleet vessels on defensive roles, guarding Siberia's coastline, rather than having them venture into the Pacific. Japan played a big role in this strategy. In fact, subsequently to the signing of the 1978 US-Japan Security Guidelines, at the time, Japanese Prime Minister Suzuki Zenko pledged to use the Maritime Self-Defense Forces, MSDF, in the defense of the Pacific Sea lines up to 1,000 nautical miles from Japan's shores. This pledge is of extreme importance, specifically in light of the constitutional constraints that hanged from the use of Japan's armed forces in the defense of the country. For example, the Article 9 forbids to maintain land, sea, and air forces, and only in 1954 Japanese policymakers were able to find a suitable interpretation that allowed the creation of something resembling an army, the so-called Japanese Self-Defense Force, JSDF. However, in the Cold War context, and thanks to Soviet retaliatory attack threats, Japan was able to push the boundaries of the legislative interpretation of the Article 9, assuming an increasingly active role in hindering Soviet operation in the Northern Pacific. Japan became the shield protecting US forces in the region, which in turn could have solely focused on striking Russian bases if needed. Thanks to this new role, JSDF operations became more and more specialized in constraining Soviet forces within the Sea of Japan and collecting intel on every submarine and warship's movement in the area. From the 70s throughout the late 80s, Japanese forces developed advanced intelligence acquisition and anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Particularly, they started controlling the straits of Tsukushima, Tsugaru, and La Perouse with aircrafts and hydrophones, setting an advanced early warning system against any possible leakage of submarines from the Soviet's Pacific Fleet homeport of Vladivostok. This is still one of the most valuable Russian naval bases, as is one of the few navigable ports in winter in the whole of Russia. With the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s, the rise of Chinese economic and military clout in the first year of the 2000s, Japanese strategic planners started to slowly but steadily shift their strategic focus from the north of the archipelago to the south. In a similar fashion to the encirclement of Russian naval bases in the Sea of Japan and Oshkosh, Tokyo's military commanders set for a containment strategy against Chinese expansion towards the First Island Chain. The First Island Chain concept represents an imaginary string starting from the southern tip of Kyushu all the way down the South China Sea, encompassing the Japanese Nansei Shoto archipelagos, Taiwan, and the northern tip of Luzon Island in the Philippines. The First Island Chain in the Chinese eyes represents its immediate backyard, and therefore an essential buffer region in securing its coastal borders. Over the years, Beijing's strategic planners have been focusing on figuring out a way to secure its maritime borders and the few passageways linking its eastern and northern ports to the Pacific Ocean. The home ports for the northern and eastern fleets, Qingdao and Ningbo, are cut off from directly accessing the western Pacific by the Japanese archipelago and Taiwan. Indeed, the only few passageways connecting the East China Sea with the open ocean are through a series of straits and choke points, all under the crosshairs of China's regional competitors. While in the South China Sea, the PRC has in over 2 decades developed a network of bases built on man-made islands. Beijing has been trying for many years to expand its control over the First Island Chain by aggressively contesting the disputed islands with Japan and Korea, but also by pushing these countries' fishing and oceanographic vessels out of international waters. Some analysts have argued that China might even push for building artificial militarized islands like the one in the South China Sea. On the flip side, Japanese strategy is focused on opposing Chinese expansionism plans. Tokyo is looking to stop Beijing advance by installing anti-ship and anti-aircraft batteries on the islands stretching from the tip of Kyushu down to the Miyakojima archipelago. Equipping these islands with long-range anti-ship missile capabilities would create a powerful barrier cutting off, or at least hindering, direct access to the Western Pacific for Chinese warships and submarines. As of now, for the Chinese Navy, there are two main passageways that hold particular strategic relevance. These are the Miyako Strait and the Bashi Channel. The Miyako Strait is the only international waterway passage into the Pacific, spreading from Okinawa Islands at the north and Miyakojima's archipelago at the south, close to Taiwan. Any ships sailing through this would have to pass the crosshair of Japanese radars and anti-ship batteries, making it a formidable obstacle for every navy. For China, this strait offers the most direct access into Western Pacific from its north and eastern coasts, and the lack of control over this body of water drastically dampens its blue water power projection capabilities and mines the security of its coastal border. The Bashi Channel instead is a much wider body of international waters, expanding from Taiwan's southern coast to the tip of northern Luzon Island in the Philippines, connecting the South China Sea with the Pacific Ocean. Compared to the Miyako Strait, the Bashi Channel is a more viable entrance to open waters for the PRC Navy, as not only is it much wider and deeper, but it is also much less patrolled by Taiwan and the Philippines, as these countries have limited air and sea surveillance capabilities. Japanese top officials are effectively creating a denial strategy that would take a huge toll in resources and time against any forceful breakthrough into open seas. In a similar manner to the Soviet containment strategy, Japan is once again taking an active role in the alliance with the US in creating a protective curtain, shielding direct access into the Pacific Ocean to Chinese forces. It seems that Japan is also starting to normalize its situation in terms of self-defense. If you like this video, leave a comment and a like. Otherwise, the other button seems to work fine too. Thanks for watching, and have a nice one.